My name is Elena Stafford, and I am 39 years old. At the Sunday dinner where my parents ended things, my mother set the table the way she set it for occasions that required the room to say something about the family that occupied it. The good china, the silver, the tablecloth that came out 4 times a year. James sat across from my father and answered every question honestly. That was the problem. 3 weeks later, my mother put my grandmother's pearls in a cream envelope and set them on the table and said, "If you do this, you are not our daughter anymore." Do you understand that? I understood it. I picked up the envelope. I drove to the courthouse on a Saturday morning. I married James Park in front of 2 witnesses we found in the hallway, and a judge who had done this enough times that he said the words without looking at his notes. I was wearing a dress from a consignment shop. James was wearing the only suit he owned. My grandmother was in the second row in a blue hat I had never seen. Before last month, James completed the acquisition of Stafford Community Bank. My grandfather, Edward Stafford, founded Stafford Community Bank in 1962 from a single branch office on Cedar Street. His photograph has hung in that lobby for 61 years. My father, Richard, has sat on its board for 19. My family built their identity around that institution the way certain families do, using a building with their name on it as proof of something they needed proven. James's name is on the letterhead now. Before I tell you what happened when my father got the call, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I want to know where you're listening from. Now let me take you back. Not to the phone call. To a conference room in the city on a March afternoon when a man I had never met was presenting to a half-empty room and saying something true. Growing up in Millfield, the Stafford name meant something specific, and my parents were the custodians of what it meant. My father, Richard, ran a law firm on Main Street and sat on the bank board and served on the boards of 2 other institutions and was the kind of man whose reputation in Millfield County had been built over 40 years of deliberate positioning. He was not careless with the name. He was its steward. He understood the name's value the way you understand the value of something you have inherited and are responsible for maintaining and intend to pass on intact. My mother, Catherine, ran the household and the family's social obligations and the annual Stafford Foundation gala with the same competence she brought to everything. She was warm with the people she had chosen. She was present and organized with her family. She had a picture of what her children's lives were supposed to look like, and the picture was detailed, and she had been developing it for a long time. My brother Thomas is 4 years older. He went to Williams, then to a law firm in Boston, then back to Millfield to join my father's practice. He married a woman named Claudia, whose family had property in Connecticut. He did everything in the correct order, and my parents' faces, when Thomas was in the room, had the quality of people watching. Something proceed as designed. I went to Whitmore University, finance. I chose it because I was genuinely interested in finance and because the Stafford name's value was financial at its core, and I thought understanding finance was the most honest way to understand my own family. After graduating, I went to work at an investment analysis firm in the city. I was good at the work. I came home for Sunday dinners and holidays, and I performed the correct version of myself, and nobody examined it closely enough to find the seams. The seams were there. Had always been the child who asked questions at the dinner table that required more space than the dinner table had. Not provocative questions, genuine ones. When I was 12, I asked my father what the bank's return on equity was. He said, "Where did you learn that phrase?" I said, "I read it." He said, "It's fine, Elena, eat your dinner." The conversation about the dry cleaning business of one of our neighbors, what its margins were, what the lease on the Main Street location cost, whether the owner understood her own unit economics, was not a conversation my family wanted at dinner. The question of whether the bank was optimally capitalized for its market position was not a question anyone wanted from a 15-year-old. I learned to hold the questions until I was somewhere they could be answered. My grandmother, Margaret, was where they could be answered. Margaret Stafford was my father's mother. She was 80 years old when I was 27. She drove herself to the grocery store and the library and the monthly meeting of a book club she had been attending since 1989. She had been widowed for 14 years and had arranged her widowhood with the specific competence of a woman who had been managing things well before her husband died and found the solo management not significantly different from the joint management, which told you something about the prior arrangement. She had the quality of attention that ran in her family on its good days, not the version of the quality my father had, which turned outward toward reputation and position, the version that turned inward toward understanding. She looked at things to understand them. She had done this her whole life with the world and with the people in it, and she was very good at it. We talked every Sunday evening, had for years, not about the family specifically, not usually, about the world, about what I was reading and what she was reading and what I was thinking about at the firm and what I was noticing that I didn't have language for yet. She was the person I brought the unfinished thoughts to. She asked the question that made the thought finish itself. She knew about my father's measurements before I had the full language for them. She said once, when I was about 24, "Your father has confused the lobby photograph for the building." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means he's very good at understanding what things look like from the outside and less good at understanding what they're made of." She said, "That's not a failure. Lots of people are that way." She said, "You are not that way." I said, "Is that good?" She said, "It's what you are. Whether it's good depends on what you do with it." I was doing the analysis work at the firm and I was good at it, but I was increasingly aware of the gap between the analysis and the action, between the work of understanding value and the work of creating it. And I was thinking about the gap without knowing what to do with it when I went to the conference in March and James Park presented in a half-empty room at 2:30 in the afternoon. He was 30 years old. The panel was about software infrastructure for community financial institutions. The room was half full because most of the people at the conference had decided the content was too technical or too niche. The people who had stayed were mostly there out of scheduling convenience. I was there because I had read the abstract that morning, and the abstract was specific in a way that told me someone had thought about this problem from the inside rather than assembled talking points about it from outside. He talked for 20 minutes. He made one argument. He made it clearly, and he supported it with specific data, and he did not say anything he couldn't defend, and he did not oversell anything. When questions came, he answered the ones he could answer and said, "I don't know yet," to the ones he couldn't, which was rarer than it should have been in rooms like that one. I asked a question at the end. He answered it with the specific quality of someone who has thought about exactly that question before and has an answer that is still developing and wants to be honest about both parts of that. After the panel, I found him at the coffee station and asked a follow-up. We stood there for 45 minutes and missed the next session. He had grown up in the south end of the city. His father had worked in manufacturing until the plant closed when James was 14. His mother had worked in a school cafeteria. He had gotten a partial scholarship to a state university and studied computer science, and had worked for 6 years at a financial technology company before deciding the direction the company was heading was wrong and leaving to start something of his own. He had been running his startup for 8 months, 2 employees including himself, an office above a laundromat on Clement Street, revenue that was real but small. He was, by every measure my family used to measure people, nobody. I knew within 3 months that I was going to marry him, not because I had calculated a future value, not because I thought the company was going to produce something. I knew because of the specific quality of his attention and the specific quality of his honesty and the specific quality of what happened to my thinking when he was in the room, which was that it got clearer. He asked the question that clarified the thought. He did it the way my grandmother did it. I had met one person in my adult life who did that, and she was 80 years old, and here was another one who was 30 and had 2 employees and an office above a laundromat. I told my parents about him in July. I brought him to Sunday dinner in September. My mother set the table the way she set it for occasions. The Stafford House on Stafford Hill was a specific kind of house, large without being ostentatious, which is its own kind of statement, maintained with the reverence of people who understand they are custodians. My grandfather Edward had built it in 1958, and my parents had kept it exactly right for 30 years, and it was a house that said something about the family, and the saying of it was the point. James walked through the door and looked at the house the way he looked at everything, which was to understand it rather than to be impressed by it. I watched my father watch him do this, and I understood within the first 10 minutes that the dinner was not going to go the way I had hoped it would go. My mother asked about his background. He told her plainly. The South End, the state university, the financial technology company, and why he left the startup and what it did. He used no language designed to make any of it sound like more than it was. My mother received this information with the warmth she used when she was managing a situation, rather than engaging with it. My father was more direct. He asked about investors. James said he had bootstrapped it so far. My father said, so no institutional backing. James said, not yet. My father said, and revenue? James gave him the number. It was a real number, a growing number, the kind of number that someone who understood early-stage companies would have recognized as meaningful. My father did not understand early-stage companies. He understood established institutions. The number told him something was small and still. After dinner, my father found me in the kitchen. He said, Elena, I said, Dad? He said, he's not right for this family. I said, which part of this family? He said, any part of it. Said he's building something. Real, he said, he's building a software company. Above a laundromat. I said, yes. He said, Elena, I said, I know what you're going to say. He said, then you know I mean it. He said, if you pursue this, you pursue it without the support of this family. That's not a threat. That's how we operate. I said, I understand how you operate. He looked at me with the expression he used when the situation was not proceeding correctly. Then he went back to the dining room. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. The good china was stacked by the sink waiting to be washed. Through the window, the garden was dark. My grandmother's voice was in my head from a conversation we'd had 2 years before. You are not that way. Whether it's good depends on what you do with it. I dried my hands and went back to the dining room. 3 months later, I told my parents I was engaged. The Sunday dinner after that was the last 1. My father said his piece before the food came. He was measured. He said it the way he said things he had prepared. He said, "This family has a name that means something in this community. A name that has been built over 60 years. He said, "The man you're proposing to marry has no standing, no background, and no prospect of providing you the life this family expects for its children." He said, "I want you to understand that this is your choice and its consequences are yours." My mother set the pearls on the table after dinner. The envelope, her handwriting on the front, Elena. She said, "These were your grandmother's." She said, "If you do this, you are not our daughter anymore. Do you understand that?" I said, "I understand." I picked up the envelope. I drove home. I called James. I said, "Saturday." He said, "Saturday." My grandmother Margaret called me that night. She said, "I'll be there." I said, "Grandma, you don't have to choose." She said, "I'm not choosing. I'm coming to my granddaughter's wedding." She paused. "Those are not the same thing." She was in the second row of the witness chairs in a blue hat I had not seen before. She sat straight. When it was done, she hugged me, and she hugged James, and she said to him, "Take care of her." He said, "I will." She said, "I know." She said it with certainty, not reassurance. She had looked at him and looked at me and arrived at a conclusion, and the certainty was the conclusion. Afterward, we had lunch at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse. The 3 of us. She ordered the soup. She asked James about the company. He told her. She asked specific questions, the questions of someone who had been paying attention for longer than the conversation. She asked about the market size and the competitive landscape and the timeline to the next funding milestone, and why the technical approach he had chosen was better than the alternatives. James answered each question with the same quality of attention she brought to asking them. I watched this happen across a table in a diner on a Saturday afternoon, and I felt something that I did not have a word for at the time, and which I have since come to understand was recognition. At the end, she opened her purse. She took out an envelope. She set it on the table. She said, "It's not what you need. It's $50,000. She said, "I know what $50,000 does and what it doesn't do. What it does is tell a bank or an investor that someone who looked at this carefully enough to understand it put money in. That changes the next conversation you have." James looked at the envelope, then at her. He said, "Mrs. Stafford." She said, "Margaret." He said, "What are the terms?" She said, "Don't lose it." He said, "Yes." She said, "And take care of my granddaughter." He looked at her. He said, "Margaret, I'm going to do more than that." She looked at him the way she looked at things she had decided about. She said, "I know you will." She picked up her soup spoon. She said, "Now tell me about the product." He told her for 45 minutes. She asked 6 more questions. Every question was better than the last. I sat at the table and drank my coffee and watched my grandmother and my new husband have the conversation I had not known to hope for, and I understood that she had not come to the courthouse for the ceremony. She had come for this. The lunch, the soup, the specific 45 minutes of looking at what was actually there, rather than at what the lobby photograph would eventually be. I want to stop here for a second. If someone looked at you and the person you chose and understood what you were going to build before you built it, drop something in the comments. The specific people who look at beginning things and see what they're beginning. I want to know who yours was. Let me keep going. The company was called Paragon Financial Systems. I want to tell you what it actually did because the abstraction of technology company obscures the specific thing. James had understood that other people in the industry kept misidentifying community. Banks and credit unions in the 20s and 10s were being compressed from both sides. Large national banks had technology infrastructure that small institutions could not match on their own. Fintech startups were competing for the same customers with mobile-first products the community banks couldn't build quickly enough. The institutions were losing ground not because their fundamental business was wrong, but because their technology was 15 years behind, and every solution being offered to address that gap required them to replace their core systems entirely, which was expensive and risky and took years they didn't have. James had spent 6 years inside a financial technology company watching this problem be misdiagnosed. The industry kept proposing replacement. His insight was that replacement was the wrong framing. You did not need to replace the old system. You needed a translation layer that sat above it and made it function like a modern system from the customer-facing side, while leaving the underlying infrastructure intact. Not destruction, integration, not starting over. Building correctly on what was already there. He had known this was right for 3 years before he had the resources to demonstrate it. The $50,000 from my grandmother let him hire 1 more engineer. The engineer's specific skill set closed a technical gap that had been slowing the product development. 14 months after the diner, the product could be demonstrated. The demonstration produced the first institutional client, a community credit union in upstate New York with 42,000 members and technology infrastructure from 2003. The client used the product for 6 months and their mobile adoption increased significantly, and their customer satisfaction scores moved, and they wrote a case study. The case study produced the next investor conversation. The next investor conversation produced the first institutional round. was not watching this from beside it. I need to be clear about this because the story of a woman whose husband built something can become the story of a woman standing adjacent to what her husband built, and that is not the story. I was working alongside it from the beginning and formally inside it from year 4. At the investment analysis firm, my specific work was evaluating early-stage financial technology companies for institutional investors. I understood how investors in that category read a company. I understood what questions they asked and in what order and what the answers needed to do. I understood how a founding team was supposed to present and how their presentation was read by the people on the other side of the table and what the gap was between what founders thought they were communicating and what was actually being received. When James had his first meeting with a serious institutional investor, I had run the pitch with him 47 times in our apartment. On the whiteboard, we had propped against the bookcase because we did not have room for a proper desk setup, with every objection I had collected over 3 years of watching pitches go wrong in specific ways. I knew which objections would come. I knew which ones he could answer cold and which ones needed preparation, and I had helped him prepare each one. The investor asked 2 questions I had not anticipated. James answered them correctly because he understood his own business correctly. Everything else he answered the way we had prepared. He got the investment. He called me from the parking lot afterward. He said, 2 I didn't have. I said, which 2? He told me. I said, I should have seen those. He said, you got 45 out of 47. That's not a failure. I said, I'll have all of them next time. He said, there will be more times. I said, I know. He said, Elena. He said it with the quality he used when he was about to say something he wanted to land correctly. He said, you're why I got that meeting. I said, you got the meeting because your product is real. He said, I got the room because the deck was right. The deck was right because of you. I said, the product is still why you got the investment. He said, yes. And you're why there was a deck worth funding. I said, let's call it both. He said, yes, let's call it both. I left the firm at 31, 4 years married. The company had grown to 12 employees and 3 enterprise clients, and a second funding round that had valued it at a number I will not say here, but which was significantly more than the laundromat on Clement Street had suggested was possible. James needed what I had been doing informally to be formalized. I joined as a partner with responsibility for investor relations and financial strategy. My parents did not know I had done this. They knew James had a company. They did not know its name or its clients or what I was doing inside it because we had not spoken in 4 years. My grandmother was the only person in my family who knew everything. I told her on our Sunday calls. I told her about the investor meetings and the client wins and the technical challenges and the specific decisions that were hard and the ones that were clear. And she listened to all of it and asked the questions that clarified the thinking. She told me once, you are doing exactly what I hoped you would do with what I tried to give you. I said the 50,000. She said not the 50,000, the diner, the questions, the capacity to look at what is actually there rather than what it looks like yet. I said, I got that from you. She said, you had it. I just gave it room. She died 4 years after the wedding, 85 years old. She had declined over 8 months in the organized way she did everything, arranging her affairs with the thoroughness of a woman who had been managing things well for decades and intended to manage this correctly too. I was at her bedside. My father was there. We did not speak except what was necessary, and what was necessary was very little. He looked at me once, across the bed. I looked back. We said nothing. Her estate was modest in the way that estates look modest when the significant assets have been moved elsewhere. She had updated her will the previous year, her personal accounts to my father, the house on Clover Street to my father, a smaller amount to me. My father called after the funeral to discuss the estate. It was the first time we had spoken in 4 years, and it was brief and focused on the administrative, and when it was over, we had not repaired anything. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from her attorney. Not about the estate, about something separate she had left with him. The letter was 1 page. She wrote, Elena, by the time you open this, you will have built something real. I know this because I know you, and because the specific quality you brought to our Sunday conversations produces real things when it is applied for long enough. What I want to tell you is not about what you built. You know what you built. I want to tell you why I structured things the way I did. Why your father received what he received, and you received what you received. She wrote, your father is a good man. He loves his children genuinely. He also has a specific limitation, which is that he measures worth by position, and has measured it that way for long enough that the measuring has become invisible to him. He looks at the lobby photograph and sees the building. You look at the building and understand what holds it up. I gave your father the things that matched his way of measuring. I gave you the things that matched yours. The 50,000 was not the gift. I think you know that. The gift was the soup and the questions and the 45 minutes of paying the correct kind of attention to someone who deserved it before he had the evidence that deserved it. She wrote, your father is afraid of what he doesn't understand. That has been true for a long time, and it has cost him things, and I have watched it cost them. Don't wait for the fear to go away. It may not. Build anyway. He will find his way to you. I believe that. I want you to believe it too. She wrote at the bottom, I love you, Elena. I loved our Sundays. I loved watching you pay attention. The willingness to look at what is actually there, rather than at what it looks like yet, is the rarest quality I have found. You have it completely. Use it for your whole life. I read the letter in the car outside the attorney's office. James was in the passenger seat. He read it after me. He folded it along its creases and held it for a moment and did not say anything. Then he said, She was right about you, I said. She was right about both of us, he said. Yes. He put the letter in his jacket pocket. He kept it there for 3 days. I didn't ask him to give it back. He gave it to me on the 4th day, refolded. Without explanation, I put it in the fireproof box. The years between 27 and 38 are not a montage. I want to say that clearly because I know they look like one from outside. Woman leaves family, builds company, acquires bank, reconciles. Told that way, it takes 40 seconds. The actual years took 11, and each one had its own weight, and its own calculation, and its own specific texture of doing. Work you believe in inside a life that is not what the people who raised you thought it would be. The loneliness of that is real, and I will not pretend it isn't. Not all the time. Mostly not. But at the edges of things, at holidays and Sunday evenings, and the moments when you are tired enough that the infrastructure you built feels temporarily insufficient, the absence of your family is present in a specific way. You don't stop wanting them to see it. You just get better at not needing them to. James understood this without being told. He would check on me after certain days, not in a way that required me to perform being fine, and not in a way that opened the wound, just a look or a question that acknowledged the thing was there without requiring it to be the subject of the evening. This is a skill, and it is a rare one, and I noticed it every time. The company grew steadily, not explosively. The kind of growth that comes from a product that works and clients who tell other clients it works, and a team that is managed by someone who is honest about what he knows and honest about what he doesn't, and builds the culture of the company around both of those qualities. By year 7, we had 200 institutional clients. By year 9, we had 400 across 14 states. By year 10, we had expanded to 3 cities, and the revenue was in a category that the financial press noticed and wrote about in the way they write about companies that have been building quietly for long enough that the story has a shape. My specific contributions shifted as the company grew. Early, it was the investor relationships and the financial modeling and the deck work. By year 5, it was investor relations and board management and the strategic planning work, the forward analysis that told us where the market was moving and where we should be when it got there. By year 9, I was running a team, not a large one, a focused one doing the work that the company needed done in the way I did it, which was look at what is actually there and tell the truth about it. James and I made the decisions together the way we had always made them. At the kitchen table usually, with whatever information we had at the time, accepting that the information was never complete, and building from what we had toward what we could see. We had a shorthand by then. Years of operating from shared understanding of what we were trying to do produces a specific efficiency of communication. He would lay something out and I would finish the thought. I would start the analysis and he would see where it was going. We disagreed sometimes. We disagreed directly and specifically, and one of us was right, and we found out which one and adjusted. Neither of us held the outcome against the other. That is something that needs to be practiced, and we had been practicing it for 11 years. In year 11, he set a document on the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. I looked at it. A preliminary analysis of the Stafford Community Bank Holding Company. I said, James, he said, I've been looking at it for 6 months. I said, 6 months. He said, the fundamentals are not strong. He said it plainly, the way he said things that were plainly true. The board has been conservative about technology investment for 4 consecutive years. Their market share in the county has eroded. They have 3 board members who have been privately advocating for a capital infusion or an acquisition for 18 months. Within 18 months, the pressure to do one or the other will be impossible to ignore. I said, that's my family's bank. He said, I know. I said, my grandfather built it. He said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I want to be clear about something. This is a correct acquisition on the financial merits. The bank has a real customer base and real assets and significant brand equity in the county. Their technology infrastructure is exactly the problem our product was built to solve. If this bank had a different name on it, I would already be further along in the analysis. He said, I looked at it because of the merits. I'm telling you because it's your family. I said, you need to tell me what you actually want to do. He said, I want to make an offer. If the merits were wrong, I wouldn't. They're not wrong. I said, then make the offer. He looked at me. He said, Elena, I said, the merits are the merits. If you let the family connection change the analysis, that's a worse outcome than any other outcome. He said, I know. That's not what I'm worried about. I said, what are you worried about? He said, you. I said, I'm fine. He said, I know you're fine. I want to know if you're sure. I looked at him. 11 years. The panel. The coffee station. The envelope with the pearls. The courthouse. My grandmother's blue hat. the diner and the soup and 45 minutes of questions. The whiteboard propped against the bookcase. The parking lot phone call. The 47 questions and the 45 answers and the 2 we hadn't anticipated and the next 47 after that. 11 years of building something from the correct assessment of a real problem. And we had built it, and it was built, and it was ours. I said, I'm sure. He said, okay. Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table beside the acquisition analysis. A frame. Small. The kind you set on a desk. Inside it, a single share certificate. Paragon Financial Systems. Issued to Elena Park. Date. Our first wedding anniversary. The year we had almost nothing. He had framed it. I looked at the frame. Then at him, he said, when I gave you this, you asked what it was worth. I said nothing yet. You said, then it's perfect. You put it on the bookcase. I said, I remember. He said, when the acquisition closes, I want you to have a number to put beside it. Not because of the money, because this is ours and you should know what ours built. I said, James. He said, you built this. Not beside me, with me. Everything we are looking at on this table is because of both of us. I said, I know. He said, I want them to know that. I said, they won't understand it. He said, they'll understand that the bank changed hands. They'll know who owns it. That's a start. The acquisition took 9 months. I want to tell you something true about those 9 months, which is that they were not clean. There was a part of me that was not purely motivated by financial merits. There was a part that was aware of what it would mean for my father to receive the call telling him that the bank his own father built, the bank his name was synonymous with in Millfield County, the institution whose lobby held his father's photograph and whose board he had sat on for 19 years, had been acquired by the company founded and run by the man he had told his daughter was not right for this family. I did not pretend this part wasn't there. I talked to James about it. He said, the merits are the merits. You know that. I said, I know. He said, the other part is also real. You don't have to pretend it isn't. I said, what do I do with it? He said, nothing. You let it be what it is and you don't let it run the analysis. I said, and if the analysis says proceed? He said, then you proceed and the key other part exists alongside it and you don't confuse the two. I did not confuse the two. The due diligence took 4 months and confirmed everything the preliminary analysis had shown. The bank's technology infrastructure was significantly behind its competitors. Its margins had compressed for 4 consecutive years. 2 of its 7 board members had been quietly advocating for a sale. The bank needed exactly what we had, and we had exactly what the bank needed. We made an offer through an intermediary. The board accepted after 3 weeks of deliberation. My father voted no. He was one of 3 who did. The other 4 voted yes, and the motion carried and the acquisition proceeded. And my father did not know the buyer's identity until the morning. The press release went out. The press release went out on a Thursday morning in October at 9 a.m. It named Paragon Financial Systems as the acquiring entity. It named James Park as incoming chairman of the board. It named me as a partner in the company. My brother Thomas called me at 9:40. He said, Elena? I said, Thomas, he said, you knew. I said, yes. He said, for how long? I said, 9 months. He said, and you didn't tell us. I said, it was a pending acquisition. You were connected to the acquired institution. He said, we're your family. I said, you're also connected to a party in a material transaction. He was quiet. Then, that's fair. I said, yes. He said, Dad is not okay. I said, I know this is hard for him. He said, can you call him? I said, not today. He said, when? I said, when he's ready to talk rather than ready to say something he can't take back. He said, that's fair. He said, Elena, I want to say something. He stopped. He said, when you married James, I knew you were right. I knew Dad was wrong. I didn't say anything because saying something would have made me a problem, and I had never been a problem, and I didn't know how to be one. I said, Thomas. He said, I know it's not the moment. I just want to say it. I said, I hear you. He said, I'm sorry I didn't say it then. I said, okay. He said, that's it? Just okay? I said, it's what I have right now. Is that enough? He said, yes. He said it quietly. Yes, that's enough. My father called 4 days after the announcement. I let it ring twice. Not from uncertainty. From giving myself the transition the call required, I answered. He said, Elena. I said, Dad. He said nothing for a moment, long enough that I listened to the silence and tried to understand its contents. He said, James bought the bank. I said, yes. He said, you were part of it. I said, yes. He said, the whole time. I said, the company has been ours for 11 years. The acquisition was 9 months. He said, I didn't know what the company was. I said, no. He said, I didn't know what you were doing. I said, no. You didn't ask. He received that. He didn't deflect it. He said, that's true. I said, I know. He said, I was wrong. I waited. I let it sit in the space between us where it had needed to sit for 11 years. He said, I know that doesn't reach it. I know that 11 years, and he stopped. He said, there isn't a sentence that covers 11 years. I said, no, there isn't. He said, your grandmother. He said her name and stopped. She knew I said she came to the courthouse. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I counted to 30 without meaning to. He said, she never told me. I said, I asked her not to. She respected it. He said, she came to the courthouse. I said, she wore a blue hat. She sat in the second row. He said, she always wore a hat to things that mattered. I said, yes. He said, Elena. He said it with something I had not heard in it before. Not the assessment voice. Something older than that. Something from before the dinner table and the measurements. He said, I made a decision in 40 minutes at a Sunday dinner based on what I knew how to measure. And I dismissed what I didn't have a way to measure, which was him and you, and what the two of you were. He said, I have been telling myself for 11 years that I was protecting the family. He said, I was protecting an idea of the family. He said, I was wrong. I said, yes. He said, I want to meet him, properly, not the Sunday dinner. Actually meet him. I said, yes. He said, when are you ready for that? I said, Saturday. The Saturday dinner was not a resolution. I want to say that plainly because the clean version, the version where the parents arrive and the meal heals the 11 years, would be a lie dressed as a story, and I have told enough lies in my life by omission, and I am not adding more. My father arrived with wine and the posture of a man who has been right about most things for 64 years and is learning the specific experience of having been wrong about a significant one for a long time. He was not at ease. He was trying to be present, and the trying was visible, and visible trying is more honest than performed ease, and I took it as what it was. My mother brought the pearls. She set them on the entryway table without ceremony when she came through the door. She looked at me. I looked at the envelope. I picked it up and put it in the bowl where I keep my keys. That was the whole thing. James opened the door for them. He shook my father's hand. My father held the handshake slightly longer than necessary, and James let him hold it, which was the right thing to do, which James always knew the right thing to do. My father looked at James the way I had watched him look at the acquisition analysis when Thomas had sent it to him, the way of a man reassembling a picture from new information. He said, you built something real. James said, we built something real. My father looked at me. Then at James, he said, yes, I understand that now. We had dinner. At the table in the apartment James and I had bought 3 years ago, which was not on Stafford Hill and was not large, and did not have anyone's name on the front of it. Food I had made and James had made. My parents ate and asked questions, and the questions were better than I expected. Particularly my father's questions about the bank integration and what the technology transition would require, and what timeline James was working from. The questions were the questions of someone who had been paying attention for the 4 days since the press release, which told me something I noted. At the end of the evening, my father and James sat at the kitchen table while my mother and I moved to the living room. They talked for an hour. I did not hear all of it. James told me afterward what he could. My father had asked about the vision for the bank. James had explained it. My father said, my father built it because he believed community institutions serve a function national banks can't. James said, that's why I wanted it. My father had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, I owe you an apology. James said, you don't owe me anything. My father said, I dismissed you because of where you came from. That was wrong. And it cost me 11 years with my daughter. James said, it cost me 11 years with my wife's family. He said, but we built something in those 11 years. I'm not sure we would have built the same thing with different circumstances. My father said, she's extraordinary. James said, I know. I knew it at a coffee station at a conference 13 years ago. My father said, I didn't see it. James said, you're seeing it now. My father said nothing for a moment. Then, the name is staying on the bank. James said, yes. My father said, your decision. James said, yes. My father said, my father would have respected you for that. James said, I hope so. My father said, he would have. My mother called me the Sunday after the dinner. She said, I want to say something and I want to say it directly. I said, okay. She said, I put those pearls in an envelope and I set them on a table and I told you that you were not my daughter anymore. She said, I have thought about that moment every day for 11 years. She said, I told myself it was a statement about the family, about what we required. She said, I know now it was cruelty. I chose what I wanted the family to look like over who you actually were and I sent you away for it. She was quiet. She said, I know that doesn't fix 11 years. I said, no, it doesn't. She said, I know. I said, Mom. She said, yes. I said, say it again. Not for me, for yourself. Say it clearly. She was quiet. Then I was wrong. What I did was wrong. You were right about James, and I was wrong, and I let 11 years pass because I couldn't find a way to say that clearly. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, is that enough to start? I said, it's enough to start. What happened with the bank in the months after the acquisition is not a single story. It is a series of decisions made correctly. James kept the existing management team for 6 months and assessed each person during that time with the specific quality of attention he brought to every assessment, which was, look at what is actually there and tell the truth about it. He promoted 3 people who had been doing excellent work without sufficient recognition. He parted ways with two people whose approach to the technology integration was not compatible with what the work required. He did this clearly and fairly, and in each case, the person who departed received the honest account of why. The Stafford name stayed on the building. James made this decision on his own and told me after. He said, "Your grandfather built something real in this community. The name means something to the people who bank there. We are not changing what works." I said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know. It was the right call." My father received this information through the board communication about the transition plan. He called me the afternoon he read it. He said, "The name is staying." I said, "Yes." He said, "James decided that." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then, my father would have respected him for that. I said, "You said that to James already." He said, "I know. I wanted to say it to you." I said, "Okay, Dad." He said, "Okay, Elena, it has been 8 months. My parents and James and I have dinner once a month, not at the house on Stafford Hill. They sold it last year. The right decision. My father made it with the clarity of a man who has been releasing things he held too tightly. They live in a smaller house in Millfield that feels, when I visit, like a place someone actually lives rather than a statement about a family. Thomas came to dinner in January. He brought Claudia. It was slightly formal and slightly uncertain, and had the quality of two families who have been in a complicated arrangement for a long time, finding out what an uncomplicated one looks like. We are finding out it is slow. It is real. James and I go to the bank on Cedar Street sometimes. Not often. When James has board business, I come with him. We walk through the lobby. My grandfather's photograph is still there, the framed one from the 1962 opening. He is standing in front of the Cedar Street branch in a suit, younger than I imagined him, looking at something outside the frame with the expression of a man who understands what he is building. James stops at the photograph every time. I watch him look at it. I asked him once what he sees. He said, "A man who understood that the thing he was building would outlast him if he built it correctly." I said, "And?" He said, "And I want to do that." I said, "You already are." He said, "We already are." The framed share certificate is on my desk at home. 1 share. Paragon Financial Systems. Issued to Elena Park, our first anniversary. The year we had almost nothing. The year the whiteboard was propped against the bookcase and the deck had 47 questions to answer, and we answered 45 of them correctly on the first try and found the other 2 and answered those 2. He gave it to me and said, "This is what we're building." He said it with the specific quality of someone who could see it, who had looked at the problem and the solution and the distance between where they were and where the thing would go, and could see the whole distance. Even then, I could see it, too. That is what my grandmother saw at the diner. Not the company, not the certificate. The quality of 2 people who could look in the same direction and see the same thing and understood what the seeing required of them. She wrote in her letter, "The gift is the willingness to sit at a diner and look at someone who doesn't have a lobby photograph yet and understand what they're going to build." She was right. That is the inheritance. Not the 50,000, the soup, the questions, the 45 minutes, the specific willingness to look at what is actually there rather than at what it looks like from outside. My family looked at the lobby photograph, looked at what was going to build it. I was right about what I was looking at. My grandmother was right about me. James built something real. We built something real. The name is on the building and it belongs to us, and we are building from it the way my grandfather built from his name, which is correctly with the intention that it outlasts us, with the understanding that what holds a building up is not the photograph in the lobby, but the decisions made correctly over a long period of time by people who looked at what was actually there and told the truth about it. That is the whole thing. That is all of it.